Welcome to The Political Animals, a show where two political philosophers, one a right-wing radical, the other a left-wing heretic, come together to discuss the social, political and cultural issues of our day. I'm one of those philosophers, Jonathan Cole. The other is Holly Lawford-Smith. Holly, this is our final episode. How are you going?
I'm good. I'm actually feeling pretty gleeful because some of our routine listeners might remember that you made me read this horrible paper recently about the incredible brilliance of white men. And today I get my revenge. Today we read about political lesbianism.
Yeah. And what a fascinating topic it was indeed. And you supplied me with 4 readings, which I've read.
Yep.
Where do we dive into this one?
Yeah. Well, that sounds like a lot of homework, doesn't it? But I'll just to exonerate myself slightly for our there's a lot of during the second wave egalitarianism about working out ideas. And so it's the format. There are some academic papers and we read a chapter of a book, but the format was often like these feminist magazines, and then people would write in, maybe they're not academics or they're just sort of like involved in feminist politics and they're having their opinion. So 3 of the pieces we read, were these like short sort of magazine contributions, but all oriented toward trying to work out what is that fair? Do you agree with that? That what lesbianism, in what sense lesbianism is political, or in what sense it can make a contribution to the feminist movement and various issues that come up in trying to argue for and articulate that.
I've got an idea. What if, because a lot of people listening will have no idea what this is, right? They'll be new to the concept as I was. So why don't I tell you what I understood it to signify as an outsider.
Where it is political lesbianism, the concept. Yeah, that sounds good.
I know it's not obvious, but I'm not a lesbian. And
what?
I'm not a feminist either.
Things have really changed because today men can be lesbians, can't they, under Australian law? So.
That's why it's important to clarify, because it's not... one could not be too sure. So,
right. So
I'll tell you what I understood it to mean, and then you can respond to that, and that can kick off the discussion. So, political lesbianism, as I understand it from these 4 pieces of writing, is really the ultimate and final manifestation of feminism, insofar as the feminists can choose, and this was really emphasized in some of them, to be a lesbian as a way of rejecting and resisting the patriarchal society of which one prominent institution in which women are repressed is heterosexual marriage. And so this particular type of feminist, which is not all feminists, and that's one of the interesting tensions I think that is kind of broached in these articles, the kind of relationship between political lesbians, if you like, and I guess feminists who choose to remain in heterosexual relationships of one kind or another. So that for me, the primary kind of starting point is feminism, not lesbianism, it seems.
Yep.
So these are kind of really politically committed, I would say ideological feminists, which for me is a neutral term, not a negative term, just in the sense that these people have what I would call a feminist worldview, as opposed to what I would call the kind of soft feminism that a lot of women have these days, which doesn't seem to come with huge political commitment.
Yep.
And so they choose a lesbian lifestyle. I think it was described in a few places as a lifestyle, and we should explore the relationship between those who would say they're not lesbians by choice, but as Gaga says, they were born that way, which was something I really wanted to talk to you about, because that was an interesting kind of contrast to me. And so the lesbianism is a kind of political act in the first instance.
But can you say what because I just if this is meant to be clarifying, can you maybe say what you think lesbianism means? such
Well,
that it could be political or a choice? Because I think that's like a very important part of the story.
yeah.
And from what you're saying, it sounds like you're meaning it in the ordinary way that people currently understand it. And I don't think that's what they meant.
No, indeed. So there's a contrast. I think the easiest way to explain it, the way I think of it is, the current. I was thinking a lot about this. The current signals or message someone like me, as a heterosexual man, gets just from the general culture about lesbianism is that a young girl at some point, presumably during puberty, when most people's sexuality develops, discovers that she's attracted to girls, not boys,
Mm-hmm.
and that this is something kind of innate. That's just part of that girl's nature. Some
Yeah.
people are born heterosexuals, some are born lesbians. Now, whether that's true or not, and clearly it's not true of all lesbians, as these readings show, that is, I think, the overwhelming message that comes out of the LGBTIQ movement. And it seemed, and I think some of the authors alluded to this in these political lesbian writings, that was a big part of the argument for equality of rights, was like, well, we don't choose to be this way, so it's
Yeah.
grossly unjust to like criminalize our sexuality when it's completely out of our control.
Yeah.
This is a choice that comes out of the feminist ideology. That's why I say it's driven by feminism. So it's about withdrawing sex from men and not propping up the institution of heterosexual marriage, which, not alone, but it's one of the key institutions that within this kind of patriarchal edifice reinforces gender stereotypes, etc., etc. But then also there's a kind of constructive phase of wanting to commit your energies, your attention, your care to other women,
Yeah.
and sort of build a kind of female community that is free of males. So there was a kind of emphasis in one of the, or not an emphasis, but there's mention of female-only spaces.
Yeah.
Ahead of time, actually, as well.
Yeah.
So that's kind of my impression as someone who's never read anything
Yeah.
in this before.
No, I think that's right. And I think the constructive, what you call the constructive element or whatever, is really important. And I think it's just worth flagging because this topic of political lesbianism, it has been extremely incendiary inside the feminist like resurgence in the last kind of like 5 or more years. And I think one of the reasons it's been so controversial is that people just take it on its face. So the colloquial meaning to be something like being a lesbian for political reasons.
Mm-hmm.
And that looks so much like trans activism that people are like they react really defensively, like a lesbian is a lesbian. I don't want a bisexual or a straight woman like faking minority status and claiming political solidarity with
Mm-hmm.
the real lesbians or whatever, or I don't want people like appropriating my identity. So you get into all that discourse and it's sort of beside the point of what the women at the time, like during the second wave, were trying to say. So I think you put your finger on now I've forgotten the pulse. That's not the saying. You hit the nail on the head or whatever,
Yeah.
in the sense of like woman-identified woman would be an alternative way to express what political lesbian meant in that context. Like choosing not to put your service energies into men.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not just in sex, but also throughout marriage, but also throughout patriarchal societies altogether, like women propping up men emotionally and more broadly. So choosing not to do that, withdrawing romantically and sexually from men, and then pouring your energies into feminism and solidarity with other women. And that, of course, is something like that is a very political act, at least if you believe that there is a patriarchy and it needs a solution or a revolution. And that's very different in spirit to like going around as a straight woman pretending you're a gay. And so a lot of the
Does that happen, though?
what do you mean?
Does that happen? Is that a phenomenon?
No, but I'm
Oh,
trying
right.
to say when people hear the words political lesbian and
Oh,
know
right. Yeah, yeah,
nothing about the
yeah, yeah,
history,
yeah.
that's what they imagine is going on.
Hmm.
And this shows up in something like Julie Bindel, for example, did this short video for The Guardian decades ago. I think it might have been in I want to say 90s, and then I'm like, was YouTube even there in the 90s? Okay, can't remember what year. Maybe a bit more
Came out in the
recent.
noughties, I think.
Okay, so
Late
we'll
nought.
put the video in the description, and that will determine when it was. But anyway, she describes herself as a political lesbian and says it was a choice. But then the more that you hear her talk about her experiences, she has all the typical like early childhood romance and attractions and so on toward women. So it's like what she's trying to express is actually something quite different than this colloquial idea that like a woman of any innate sexual orientation, which I think you're right is how we tend to think about it and how the LGBT blah 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 movement portrays it today. Yeah, it's very much not a straight or bisexual woman in that sense, can nonetheless claim that they're a lesbian, and that's a good thing to do in some way. That's like very much not the claim.
So I have a bunch of questions that I'll be interested to ask you. And the first one seems to me the big one that the authors were quite conscious of, or at least several of them.
Yeah.
Because if kind of consciously exiting as a kind of political action the institution of heterosexual marriage and choosing to use the language lesbianism with its sexual but also communal kind of connotations, if that's a kind of political act that is an expression of feminism, then the question is, how do you think about those feminists who don't make that choice, given the presupposition is that choice is open to all feminists? I sensed a couple of the authors wrestling with this because they clearly think political lesbianism is superior to kind of, I don't know what you call it, heterosexual feminism.
Yes.
And I'd just be interested in hearing your perspective on that tension and how that functions today to the extent that it exists, or because if I was going to guess, and maybe I'm totally wrong, but if you had if you had asked me prior to any exposure to this topic, just based on the kind of statistical rate of lesbians in society, I would have assumed that the majority of feminists were heterosexual, but
yes.
Okay, so
no, I think that's right. So I do think it's worth acknowledging that the lesbians were a large part of, and maybe at the vanguard of, the second wave feminist movement. So maybe that's because the feminist movement has gone mainstream, and because lesbians are a minority of women, they're not in the vanguard anymore in the way that they were then. So maybe that's important. I think this tension is like, it's super interesting, and maybe it was most prominent in the Claudia card chapter that we read. So she's a philosopher, and her book's called Lesbian Choices, published in 1995. We'll put all the papers in the notes. But she really brings out this tension really nicely, I think, which is like the woman identified woman, right, who has separated or withdrawn romantically and sexually from men, and who puts all her energy into other women. She's living with the greatest amount of integrity. That's the word that she uses. So it's like there's at least not a conflict or a dissonance between our values and the way we live. And you can imagine that in loads of other domains, right? I think the other example she uses later on is veganism or vegetarianism. It's like it's just awkward if you think that eating animals is wrong, but you're kind of embedded in a social network or family where you eat animals. You're always in conflict with yourself in some sense. But then she kind of spells out like, okay, well, if the lesbians, in this technical sense, are living in the greatest harmony with their principles or have the most integrity, there is a sort of implied criticism of heterosexual women. And she comments that like sometimes heterosexual women, right, are like almost making these bitter remarks about like, oh, you're so lucky that you're a lesbian
Yeah,
because
that's right.
you get to live
Lesbian
in
envy.
yeah, lesbian envy, because you get to kind of live this perfectly consistent feminist life, whereas like, alas, for me, I have to go home to my horrible patriarchal husband and have this kind of dominating sex, like, woe is me. And one thing that I really found helpful about that discussion is that for me, it reoriented some of the recent conflict around political lesbianism as like maybe less this misunderstanding of what the words mean and more a kind of backlash from heterosexual women. Like heterosexual women are the majority. They get this implied criticism from the lesbians that they're the like more perfect feminists. And then that's so annoying that they find a way to like push back or fight back on the political lesbians, as it were, and maybe caricaturing them or kind of deliberately misunderstanding what they're actually trying to do is one way to do that, and like, yeah, defend yourself or get yourself off the hook from having to really like face the question of whether you could do differently, whether the doing differently is like bargaining better about sex in your relationship, or think of something like the distribution of domestic labor. Like a lot of women just can't be bothered having the argument, so they do just do more than the husband. So there's all these things where you could say that a lot of heterosexual women are like going along with patriarchy and not doing as much as they could. And that's a hard thing to like face up to and tell yourself like, I really am just actually going along with this, or I actually don't want to face the fact that I should leave him or whatever. So I did find that kind of helpful and explanatory in a way, that it's like, because otherwise you might assume the lesbian is the more oppressed one, and then it might be really hard to understand what's going on between the heterosexual feminists and the lesbian feminists. But
Well, that's a really interesting point, because one thing I noticed was this language of liberation, so that the political lesbian has attained a level of liberation from the heteropatriarchy that the heterosexual feminist hasn't, which kind of confounds that idea of the lesbian being in the most oppressed class prior to the arrival of trans people and and others, certainly in the age that a lot of these are being written. So the articles were like one from the 70s, one from the 80s, and two from the 90s. And even the 90s, this
it's still going.
Still isn't wide social acceptance of gay and lesbian relationships. But it's interesting because it shows that there are some serious consequences of leaning into this notion of choice, I think, because if political lesbianism is a choice, then anyone who doesn't take the choice in some way becomes responsible for their predicament. If you think the predicament is repression, right, they are choosing to stay in some sense when there is this other option. But I also want to ask a clarifying question, because the only way I could make sense of this perspective was if the presupposition, which I'm pretty confident was implied, but you will know more than me, was that like by nature there are no kind of just heterosexual relationships. That is, even the woman who thinks she's got a loving husband, she's satisfied with her sexually or whatever, there's a kind of false consciousness at play there, and she is in some sense deluded or deceived because of the kind of structure surrounding. That was the only way I could make sense of the idea that the kind of pinnacle of feminist living was political lesbianism. Yeah. Because unless you escape from heterosexuality per se, you're not actually free.
Yeah, I think that's actually roughly right. I mean, we can argue exactly about how to express the idea of being born into injustice and being inculcated into finding it normal. Should we call that false consciousness? I mean, that is kind of what people who use that term were trying to get at, but it does go really deep and it is really hard to see. And so we do want to give people a bit of credit for that. It's not like you're an idiot if you can't see it, or there is something to explain about the people who can see it versus the people who can't. But bracketing that conversation, it's roughly right. Like, you believe that there is patriarchy in the sense of very serious social hierarchy between the sexes. You believe that girls are sort of from birth funneled into this set of behaviors that act in service of men, and that the whole like institution of heterosexual sex and marriage is kind of putting women into the physical and domestic service of men, and that all of that is like radically and deeply unjust. And in fact, I think in two of the papers that we looked at, they mentioned also thinking this is the first form of oppression. So it like gives the template to all these other social hierarchies that come along afterwards. So if you think that, then those feminists thought that can be like figured out through consciousness raising. So women get together and they're talking about these patterns in their lives, and somehow it all comes together at a certain point that like, man, men are doing really well out of this arrangement. Like, and again, I think anyone listening today who hasn't like read anything about feminism maybe just finds that really hard to swallow. So, but think about it in the 50s, or think about your grandparents' relationships or women's options back then. Like, there is a context in which that is highly plausible, even if you think we've made enough progress today that it isn't. And so, yeah, then I think the thought is like, okay, once you now really confront the fact of this social hierarchy and this really serious injustice, each individual woman does have to choose whether she will be complicit in that or whether she will go along with it. And maybe she does just think, well, okay, but racism is worse, so I'm just gonna remain subordinated and fight for this other fight. Or maybe she thinks, I just want to do my art. Like, fighting radical structural injustice or whatever is not my project. Maybe that's okay, but you can see how the revolutionaries want to recruit as many of the oppressed or subordinated as possible to their cause. And so it looks to me like the political lesbians were just trying to say, we need as many of these oppressed people as possible to recognize what's going on and to start acting in radical solidarity with each other and choosing each other rather than choosing men. And you can see that same structure playing out for like decolonial projects or for anti-racism projects or whatever else. Like, it's just solidarity among the oppressed, whoever they are, and withdrawing your labor power or political acquiescence or whatever else it is from the oppressors.
It's interesting to hear you mention decolonialism, because this kind of ideologically, it really does share a structure with contemporary views on the left of racism and colonialism.
Yeah.
Such that like a country like Australia is kind of it's a complete colonial edifice, and there's no escaping it. You might, however enlightened you think you are or whatever, colonialism is in the air you breathe. And so it has shaped your perspective and the way you live and your privilege. And similar with the systemic racism thing, there's kind of no way out of it, no matter how hard you might try. You might be a white person married to a black person, your kids are biracial, you march with at BLM, you do all this stuff, but in subtle, deeply embedded ways, you're still going to manifest racism, and at the end of the day, you're still a beneficiary of white privilege and the like. And it's interesting because I have to confess, I have an instinctive aversion to any, these strike me as very one-dimensional. Whereas when I walk around the world, I see a level of complexity that's difficult to interpret, full stop, to even get to an ideological reading. So I can see the reality of all of these ideologies in my society. So I don't deny the existence. I don't doubt the existence that there's sexism, that there's racism. I mean, you have to be literally blind or in denial not to see it.
Yeah.
But to take it to such a universalizing level, I'm not sure anything can be taken to that level intellectually. For me, it's
But
kind
is
of,
the complex, like, because I think one move to capture the complexity would just be the intersectionality move. So some theorists want to say, like, yeah, theorizing these domains separately is somehow just not quite right. And maybe that captures a bit of your discontentment. Like, the whole sort of theory of patriarchy run separately from the whole theory of racism and positioning men as the oppressor when like black men. Okay, but then so one way to do that is to be like, yeah, and these domains all come together in complicated and inextricable ways. That is like people trying to figure out how to put them together and
yeah,
exactly how that works. I personally have more skepticism about that project than about the single domain
yeah,
project, which to me looks more to have more humility, because you don't need to say there's patriarchy and this is the first and most fundamental oppression. I just want to
yeah,
say, some of them did, some of the second wavers did, but I just want to say there is patriarchy. And so on the like when it comes to sex, men are in the dominant position and women are in the subordinate, and there are lots of issues implicated there. But I'm saying nothing at all about how that interacts with racism or poverty or whatever else, and I'm completely open to that it does, or that there are like novel ways that that might happen, and that if we really wanted to get a room of people and say who was the worst off, we'd have to do an awful lot of like empirical work and question asking. So
yeah.
is it like, could something like that help with your sense that it's not complex enough, or is it a different
Um,
direction?
I'm thinking more from a different kind of paradigm, and I guess my presupposition is that social phenomena are inherently contradictory and paradoxical if you're talking about large population groups. And so if you think about something like heterosexual marriage, at one end of the spectrum, you do have oppressive marriages where the woman is subordinated. I mean, in the worst case, she could be physically and emotionally abused. But even along that spectrum, as you go along, there may be total inequality in terms of household duties, caring for the kids. Maybe she sacrifices her career for the man. Maybe the sex is satisfying for the man, but not for the woman. But the problem is there's another side of the spectrum. And then it gets harder to explain, I think, that the woman's deluded when you can see empirical facts like a fairly equitable distribution of the household chores. The guy might be a much more considerate lover. I know people where the woman is the breadwinner and the guy has sacrificed
Yeah.
for the career. So it's kind of like, I totally understand how the further back in time you go, this view maps increasingly more accurate at a universal level
Yeah.
because of the culture. And I think racism and colonialism is like this too. I think it's much more highly variable in our modern pluralistic society, probably in partly because of the impact of the feminist movement and changes in attitudes. Like you look at the wholesale change in attitudes to Aboriginals in Australia. Not everyone has got on board. Some people, it's actually hardened some people, but then there are a lot of white people who have radically different attitudes than, say, their parents did.
Yeah.
Whether they're still racist in subtle ways, perhaps. And I think, like, methodologically, I think the bridge that I struggle to walk over is like a false consciousness analysis, which I think is intrinsically plausible. Humans do have the capacity to
Yeah.
arrive at mistaken conclusions about even their own life and who they are. It happens, and we know that because people have conversions and awakenings and think, "Oh my gosh, I was an asshole, or I didn't do this right, or I was wrong about this, that, or the other." But when you're going to say, when you're going to conclude that the person who tells you and presents, at least externally, as happy with their situation, whatever it is, of course, it doesn't mean they're right, but it's much harder, I think, to substantiate the view that they're deluded, because you obviously don't have access to their
No, I agree.
internal
I guess
psychology.
maybe it is important to keep those two things separate, though, like, because your first point is about like almost how much progress would it take before we could stop making the universal claim. And I think that is an interesting question. Like, certainly by the time it's like, actually, that I don't even know if that's true, but I take it there's an amount of progress where we just like, there would be very little utility to still maintaining the theory that there is social hierarchy based on sex, or that there is a patriarchy or whatever. Like, maybe once
Well,
it's 80-20 between the relationships. So
yeah.
that is one thing. Like, at what point does this analysis in group terms start to become like unhelpful or just lacking in explanatory power or utility? But the other thing is like, look, you could have your one counterexample. Like, say all the heterosexual sex in the world that's happening is dominating and to the man's benefit, except for the one enlightened couple in the corner of Bangladesh. Okay, and now I'm wrong to tell her that she has false consciousness because she's somehow achieved this radical level of enlightenment. You could make that criticism separate of the universality criticism, right? So maybe it's just worth, like not taking those two things together, because I think I agree that there's at least something really annoying about the feminist dogmatist who insists to the person's face that they're deluded or under false consciousness when they've like done a lot of thinking and reading and they definitely aren't. But I think I've got much more reservations about like at what point we should stop saying that there's like social hierarchy based on sex. And maybe I just like, even in the allegedly good countries like Sweden or Australia or whatever, I still think there's heaps of sex-based social hierarchy issues where people are like, they think we're finished, but we're definitely not finished with that project yet.
Yeah, I would, 2 points, if I can remember the second one after making the first one, and then a question for you, which I think is interesting. I would actually separate marriage from society, other institutions. I do think that one is a bit different, and I do that because I think my view would actually differ on the empirical evidence more, because in a way, when you're talking about systems, and marriage is not a system because it's a relationship between two individuals. Every marriage is different.
It's structured by the state, right?
Well, is it these days? You have de facto relationships, you've got polyamorous ones, divorce is pretty
marriages
common. People, a certain percentage, I think it's like maybe 20-30% have affairs. Anyway, I think that's different from a social structure like the education system, for example, where there, and I say that because there could be a kind of influence that transcends whatever the individual's perspective is. Whereas two separate marriages might be quite different, because it depends much more on the attitude of those two individuals. I'm not saying that there aren't, you learn a concept of marriage and, for a Christian over here, it's this sanctity thing. For another person over here, it's just a sort of bit of paper you sign with the government. So all of that. Anyway, all I'm saying is that I think this, I think it would some of this maps better onto other social structures than marriage. I think there's more variability in heterosexual marriages these days than is recognized in this literature, although I acknowledge that even the most recent one was written 30 years ago. And marriage now is quite different. I think people have a different attitude to marriage than they did back in the day.
I think it's true that there's more variability now, but I think it's an overstatement to say that like every or even maybe most dyads are just like working things out between themselves and doing what suits them. Like, I think there's still a lot of, otherwise it just would be impossible to explain the phenomenon of women resentful about an unfair share of domestic labor. They wouldn't be resentful if that was what they wanted. But they don't want it, but they kind of fall into that, or the man is just useless and they find him useless 10 years into their marriage or whatever, or where they first have children. So it's like something about the cultural script or what is set up as normal or what your parents did make that the default. And then they make it that the woman has to really fight for equality in the relationships where that happens with the unenlightened men or whatever, or the non-feminist men. And she has to choose whether she's up for that fight and all the social disharmony that it brings. So I don't think it's true to be like, look, there's just like real heterogeneity and some people choose traditional and some don't. It's like, no, there's still a lot of something unchosen and culturally kind of set up coming into people's marriages. And I think that's also true of how sex goes for a lot of couples.
I mean, I think in a way, our discussion on this point kind of illustrates my larger concern. That is, it's very hard to know what the empirical reality is because we just don't have.
We do know with domestic labor because there's a lot of work done on that because it affects the workplace. Like if women are doing all this like double shift, then they're like less available to paid work or whatever. So there actually is like a ton of research going. Of course, sex is a kind of black box. Like I would love to be able to support my assertions about the absolute like terrible state of heterosexual sex. I suspect it, but I can't like, you would have to talk to every couple. But I think for domestic labor, we do know that.
Well, there are plenty of marriages where people aren't having sex full stop at a certain point as well. I think my large primary, I'll take that point about the domestic duties, but this really does hinge on the empirical question, doesn't it? That is, if for the assertion, the kind of universal claims to be accepted, it has to be demonstrated empirically, and it's kind of hard to know exactly because you just mentioned the good point about the sex, but the second point, because I want to get to the question, was a simple one that, it occurred to me that the kind of any false consciousness claim, whether it's a Marxist claim about false consciousness in classes or whatever, it cuts both ways. So, I mean, once you accept that humans are susceptible or capable of false consciousness, then of course it's possible that the political feminist is wrong about the nature of heterosexual marriage, right?
Because women really should be oppressed, or what?
No, just because it's not like becoming a political lesbian somehow frees you from the human possibility of false consciousness, because I would argue
it's not a universal claim, right? The claim is like women are co-opted into the service of men. That props up patriarchy. Withdrawal will collapse patriarchy. Or it's a great step toward it. So there is an empirical claim there, but the claim is just like, men would be absolutely fucked without women. And so let's try that out. Let's speed the revolution by withdrawing our availability. And I think, for me at least, that is a plausible political strategy or tool. Either it's going to lead to, like, this, my students say this whenever I teach this topic, like, either it's going to lead to men going to war on women and like more rape, more murder, more violence, more control, because they will not stand for being deprived of this thing to which they think they are entitled. Or it's going to be a successful form of blackmail that gets men into shape. And maybe it's like a bit hard to predict what way that exactly would go, but it's like the powerfulness of lesbianism understood as withdrawal. I think the authors we looked at, they're right about that. It is threatening and it is powerful, and it would go one way or the other if you could get a majority of women to actually commit to this as a feminist strategy.
Yeah. No, I take that point. I was thinking more specifically of the woman who is in what she thinks is a kind of functional, happy marriage, could be suffering from a false consciousness. But then the political lesbian critic may also be suffering from a false conscience in concluding that she's actually deluded.
But you just now are using false consciousness for the feminists to mean that they're wrong about that one particular woman because she has really done enough thinking to get out of the accusation.
No, I'm assuming a certain percentage of. Well, I think isn't it empirically true that a certain percentage of women are going to think they're relatively. It's not like there's more than one person in Bangladesh who thinks they're in a fulfilling marriage, right? Isn't that?
No, I know. But your point is like, but some of them really are. And so the feminists are wrong to say that like that woman is unhappy. Maybe it's just sort of mixing together like the feminist diagnosis of that woman as like really resenting her situation, or some counterfactual claim is true about what her attitudes would be if she knew more, and the merely strategic political claim that like women's withdrawal sexually and romantically from men, or women's prioritizing other women and collective solidarity, would have a huge political impact on patriarchy. And I mean, you could just make that claim totally separate of any claims about false consciousness. And indeed, that claim was never made in any of the papers, right? This is, you think it's an implication of the analysis of heterosexuality as...
My point is a point about false consciousness per se. So once you accept that false consciousness is a possibility that any human being could feasibly be susceptible to. So the Marxists say you get it based on class, where if you're working class, you don't perceive the way you're being exploited by capitalists. A feminist could say a false consciousness could manifest in the case of repression in heterosexual marriage. You get versions of this.
Sorry, I know, but the one point is, what is the political move that would be successful? And then another point is like, how do we diagnose the people that refuse to contribute to the politics? And I think that's where the false consciousness idea comes in, right? Because the feminists will say heaps of women are prepared to withdraw from men and become political lesbians. Hallelujah. But what do we want to say about those dumb ones that are still in their marriages to men? And that's where you could say, oh, well, they're deluded. They don't understand theory. They're not good feminists or whatever. So I take it your false consciousness explanation comes in at the level of like, what's up with those guys who look to be complicit in their own oppression?
I'm just saying it's not obvious. It's not obvious to me which way the false consciousness is going in that case. And
I think you're using false consciousness to mean people being wrong. And they don't mean the same thing. The feminists could be wrong about what's going on with the ones who refuse to be feminists. And it doesn't mean that the feminists have false consciousness about their diagnosis of the political, right? Like, it's not synonymous with being wrong. I don't have false consciousness because I don't believe in like whatever economic theory.
Yeah. Well, right? I thought we agreed that the view of the political lesbian was that all heterosexual relationships at some level are oppressive, even if the woman doesn't see it.
Yes, but that's a diagnosis of like, what is the core political problem of feminism and what would it take to solve it? And there's a kind of implication of that like, yeah, we're all inculcated so deeply into this system of propping up men that it would be a good explanation of why I would refuse to be a feminist if I did refuse.
Let me give you my question, because it kind of comes in here. I don't have a view. I don't know what the answer to this is, but what is at stake for this type of feminism in accepting, coming down from the universal claims and just saying, we have these problems, we have patriarchal institutions, some percentage of marriages, far too many are repressive or don't serve the interests of women or are unfair. Like, is there something at stake that would mean you can't come up with a more variable view, empirical view of the situation? Like, does it have to be, how important is the universality to some of these claims is what I want to understand.
I mean, I think it would be
I guess I don't see anything at stake in that myself.
This is just a broad question about how to do politics, right? Like, it seems like it would be a pretty bad politics if it was just like, oh, it's like an extraordinarily complex mosaic of interventions that could differ down to the individual couple. Like, no, to have a successful political intervention, if you think the real problem is the relations of the sexes, you're going to have something that like affects enough people in a big enough way that doing an intervention on it would bust up part of the problem. And I think that's what a lot of these feminists in the second wave were trying to search for. That is it marriage? Is it Catholicism? Is it like, what's the thing that plays the big enough role? And I think one of the most successful theories said that it was sexuality, men's control of women's sexuality and reproduction. And so that is going to like be grist for the mill, I think, for the political lesbians, because they are then refusing to participate in that. So I think, yeah, maybe absolute universality, like this just affects everyone and there's no way you could get out of it, that's probably too strong. But looking for a problem that is a major part of the explanation of the social hierarchy, or such that solving it would make great progress toward equality, yeah, that is the thing I think that feminists are looking for and should be looking for, right, if it's going to be a political intervention.
Yeah. If you don't mind, I want to move to something that came up earlier. It kind of flows from this idea of the emphasis on choice in political lesbianism.
Yep.
Because I think another, at least, kind of message you get from the outside, from the LGBTI, etc., movement. I don't know if this is a new perspective or not, but the impression you get, rightly or wrongly, about same-sex attraction, so lesbians and gays, is that not only is it innate and not a choice, it's the opposite of a choice. You literally have no choice.
Yeah.
But this is kind of really central to your identity and who you are. So unlike political lesbianism, where it seems to me feminism is the kind of foundation, and then lesbianism is a kind of expression out of that foundation, there aren't, it seems to me, ostensibly any political connotations necessarily. And in a way, it makes sense, because if I discover I'm a lesbian at 13 years of age, I'm possibly not a feminist yet, or only dimly aware of it. Maybe haven't even developed an interest in politics yet. Maybe I don't. And so for me, that kind of sexual attraction perhaps precedes any political orientation. And I'm sure there are people like that who could end up political lesbians. I don't see why you couldn't. They're not like incompatible. But it really, in a way, this was the most enlightening, fascinating thing about these readings, was how much it seemed to swim upstream against the current cultural perception I came in with, where it's like being lesbian is about my sexual attractions. It's a really core part of my identity. It makes me distinct and separate from heterosexuals, but I could be a member of a conservative political party. Maybe I deny the patriarchy. I think there's even an anecdote in there about the kind of CEO who clearly has succeeded in the hetero-patriarchal system, and he's kind of a lesbian in the bedroom, but their lesbianism is not kind of a big part, or ostensibly a big part of their identity. And I wanted to hear your perspective on, like, it seems like a tension, which I found really interesting. And is it a tension? What's the kind of perspective of political lesbianism of what I would assume is an even larger group of kind of non-political lesbians? Or am I wrong about that?
I'm just thinking, I guess, like, one thing they could say about why it is still political is, like, anything that contributes to heterogeneity or atypicality is kind of necessarily or essentially political, just because it causes friction and it requires people to sort of accommodate difference. And the thing that comes to mind, although it will make me sound more sympathetic than I am to the person, is Robin Dembroff in a Eon article a few years ago, which is a non-binary philosopher. She said something like, non-binary is an unabashedly political identity. And I don't remember the exact wording, but it was something like, for anyone who wants to wield their identity in the service of dismantling gender norms or whatever. And we, the gender criticals, kind of seized upon that as like an admission that it's a merely political identity. It's like, oh, for anyone who wants to do Judith Butler style gender fuck, they can like go around pretending to be non-binary. It just like feeds the idea that this is stupid or whatever. But I think what probably more charitably she might be taken as having said is like, she is non-binary, and maybe in this more conceived as revelation or innateness way. But the fact of there being female people who want to present themselves that way, like hairy legs, double mastectomy, gender androgynous haircut, so you can't tell at first glance what sex that person is or whatever, that kind of is political because there's such a clear social expectation of people to look clearly as what sex they are, or to not be like androgynous in a confusing way. So that's the sense in which one could be lesbian in the current LGBT innate sexual orientation sense and still think that it is political, like just merely being proud of it. The thing that I wanted to comment...
Can I just jump in and say, I guess, just feeding back to you, what I'm understanding here is that the political lesbian, I guess, could make the observation that the ostensibly non-political lesbian may just be unaware of the political implications of their lesbianism, and they might not actively
they're
participate
very different
in
politics, right? Because the lesbian who's just proud, all she's doing is creating more heterogeneity in what women can be like. They can also be gay, and what sexual expression can look like. Like women can date women, or people can date people of the same sex. And that's so different to what the political lesbians were trying to do, like get women to stand in solidarity with other women and to put their like personal and professional energies into women's liberation. Like I guess there's an argument to be had about how much of a role sexual orientation stuff needs to play in that feminist project, and the more you think it's a big role, the more maybe those two projects are overlapping. But it seems to me you could just be a like heterogeneity and diversity guy, and you're making a political contribution to that, and that's still very different from like working for the equality of the sexes. So sorry, that thing I wanted to go back and comment on was that in the thing about choice, maybe it's helpful to bring in the Claudia card stuff again, because she had that interesting discussion about how like maybe there's some dissonance in how the idea of choosing your sexual orientation or your sexual practices works. And from my reading of her, the idea was something like, morally, when we come to feel strongly enough about something, it literally ceases to be an option for us. So a really committed vegetarian, it's not that she has the option to eat meat, it's just that option is fully foreclosed to her. And so the more that we think about choice in terms of our options or what are live options for us, the less it is true that certain choices are available that might be available to people with a different politics or morality. And in that sense, it's like it does open the way to thinking, yeah, heterosexual and bisexual women can become so morally and politically committed to the project of women's separatism and the political purpose it will serve, that it is never anymore a live option for them to have sex or romance or prop up men in any way. They'll only ever be propping up other women until the revolution or something. Yeah. And so then it's like, yeah, that's such a different connotation from like a straight woman choosing to be a lesbian in the colloquial sense. It's really like, no, you have control over what your live options are, and we all could do that work to change what our live options are. Does that help at all, though? Because then I lost track of what your question was about the current tensions with the lesbians.
That's good, and okay. I do have two final observations and questions. I want to get through them with time, but the first one maybe we could do quickly, because it's just a question that arose for me, but not something we probably need to spend much time on. And I was kind of thinking about homosexuality, because I was thinking, okay, well, it's quite a different context. Like there's some commonality in the experience of oppression, right, by the state and by the culture.
Yeah.
But there isn't a comparative movement on the male side for feminism, right?
Yeah.
And there isn't all of that scaffolding around patriarchy and the like. So this is really the question, is there such a thing as kind of political homosexuality? Because it seemed to me that it wouldn't
No.
make sense in the way that political lesbianism does. But maybe I'm missing something. Like it seemed, in a way it made them even more distinct to me.
It's a funny question because it's like you're in the same breath admitting that there's not patriarchy for gay men, right? Like there's not a comparable. What would the men's politics be? Maybe
Maybe
okay.
not, but
Here's a version. Men
maybe they
going
want
with,
to challenge the hetero. Maybe for some reason they want to break
you
down
need a
the
reason,
norm
right?
of heterosexual marriage.
Okay, so I'm trying to come up with one. Maybe the men going their own way men who think that like women are just like these evolutionarily like wealth stealing, exploitative, sperm theft, whatever creatures. They think men should go their own way from women, and then they could plausibly start gay recruitment, commit your love and solidarity to other men. Oh, you think you love women, but it's very easy to like you could retrain yourself out of having a sex drive at all, or you could retrain yourself to find men erotically attractive, whatever. Within the context of a political project of sex-based separatism on men's side, you can imagine a similar kind of argument being made. But the precise reason there isn't the parallel is because for men in general, there isn't any need to withdraw. Like they're doing well out of sex-based social hierarchy, not badly.
Yeah, it brings to mind also the phenomenon of what happens in prisons, which at least provides one empirical example where it is possible to engage in same sex without considering yourself gay, I guess.
Yes, although not for political reasons, right? More for like social domination reasons, where the like, and
often
someone
there's
like
a hierarchical, you could even say a patriarchal thing going on there.
exactly.
In terms
So I was just
of
going to
very
say,
much
someone
power.
like Catherine McKinnon will say that some of those men are women in that context, like they're just replicating the dynamics of patriarchy inside the prison system between the like alpha and beta males or whatever.
Yeah. Okay, here's the final but more substantive question. This is the most provocative question I could think of. So, I was thinking about this, and it seemed to me part of me came to the conclusion that the whole recent I don't know, I'm struggling for the language here, but if for want of a better term, the success of the LGBTIQ Rainbow Coalition, and I'm defining sex here as not just acceptance, but like celebration, like a really positive, almost you could say virtue signaling. So maybe it's hollow, maybe it's cheap, whatever. I'm sure you could criticize it. That struck me as a real risk to political lesbianism because it kind of domesticates and in a way so normalizes lesbianism and homosexuality in the eyes of not everyone, but what feels like a majority, at least in the big cities. And does that undermine the revolutionary appeal and project of political lesbianism? Is it a risk that people so define it with just sexual desire and so accept that it kind of leaves no place for political lesbianism? I was just trying to understand that the kind of impact of what seems to me pretty radical social changes in the social attitude to same-sex marriage. So on the not same-sex marriage, but
gay rights.
Yeah, gay rights and same-sex marriage, I guess, is a good example. So that's a big win, right, in terms of what the activists campaigned for a long time, and it is a sign. The fact that a majority voted for it in Australia is a sign of, it's a kind of empirical evidence of a very significant change in attitudes within one generation. But does that kind of stuff serve the interests of political lesbianism, or is it in some sense ultimately a threat because does the next generation of women just come up and say there's nothing to see here, this issue has been settled?
I mean, I guess in a sense it depends on how much you're hung up on the word. So I think you would be right that it makes it kind of toothless if the thing that matters is the word lesbian. And then in the second wave, the political lesbians, the lesbian feminists were fighting for the meaning of the word lesbian to be feminist, woman-identified woman separatist. And then, okay, they lost that fight, and the current gay rights movement or pride celebrations and so on, they do like completely take the political power, or most of it, given what we said in the last discussion, they take the political power out of that. But if you just care about the ideas, yeah, okay, so now lesbian just has settled into meaning this thing, sexual orientation, but the spirit of the separatist idea, or being a woman standing in radical solidarity with other women, or refusing to be complicit in patriarchy, all those ideas still stand and still have relevance. It just would be better to express them as feminism, or like being a woman-identified woman, or like showing your main solidarity to women rather than men. And those ideas today, I actually think, are more radical than they even were. Maybe I should say differently radical, because they were certainly very radical in the second wave. But like feminism itself has become so toothless and so anti-separatist, like everyone thinking that like we should be solving all the problems at once. It would just be anathema to suggest that we should like withdraw from men in some way. And I think a lot of women would see that as a failure of compassion, like poor men, like that would be terrible. Shouldn't we all be working together for this new future? So I think the ideas that are expressed in these kind of political lesbian feminist texts, they remain extraordinarily radical and salient. Like, I wish we were talking more about what kind of contribution it would make to feminism for a whole bunch of women to withdraw from men for political reasons. And I do try to raise this with my students, and generally they're not sympathetic at all, because they're all sort of like, oh, that'd be terrible for men, and we like our boyfriends. And yeah, I'm just like, oh, disappointing.
You've got an uphill battle.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Well, Holly, I think we've reached the end. Really fascinating topic to finish on. I don't know if that was supposed to be punishment. It felt like the opposite of
No,
punishment.
you enjoyed it more than I anticipated.
I think I enjoyed that a lot more than you enjoyed Hopper.
Yeah.
But as I said at the intro, this is our final show, and we're going to leave the videos up in perpetuity for as long as YouTube exists, which I expect to be about the next 3,000 years or so, it seems.
Imagine the views by then. It's going to be amazing.
Yeah. So I was going to say, look, if you want to help other people discover the show in the coming years, give this video and others a like, drop a comment. If you want to weigh into the discussion, we all worship at the altar of the paganistic pantheon of algorithms. We're not monotheistic with our algorithms. We have many gods now that run our lives on different platforms, so we have to appease all of them, just like the pagans of ancient times. But Holly, it was a lot of fun.
I usually delete these bits out when I edit the video, but because this is the last one, I'll leave it in.
Yeah, why not? Well, most people probably don't get to the end of the show.
I'm like
anyway,
Jonathan going on at the end about like, subscribe, delete.
All right, I think that's my cue to
Bye, everyone.
leave.
Bye forever.
Thanks for listening. Catch you later.